It is an honor and privilege to introduce Phyllis Reynolds, who will present the 2021 Plummer Lecture. I first met Phyllis as a fellow teen parent when our daughters ran cross country together and played on the high school soccer team. Over time, we discovered that we both shared the Quaker faith and the same healthcare profession. She added new words to my vocabulary, like ginormous, tumultuous, and intrepid. She lives her life, in the words of Arthur Larrabee, quote, in the alignment with the spirit, unquote. With deep spiritual awareness, her life has meaning, it's full of joy and dynamic energy, making the most of her time every day. In addition to faithful service and clerking numerous committees at Evanston Friends Meeting and Illinois Yearly Meeting, she manages to find time to eagerly walk in the sun, to garden, to knit, bike ride, and attend our local farmers market. Phyllis also loves nature, walking in the woods, bird watching, foraying into the world of mycology, and listening to the peeping of the pond frogs at McNabb. She enthusiastically cherishes the history, legacy, and grounds of the Illinois Yearly Meeting House. Phyllis is spiritually curious, exploring in depth the faith practices of Buddhism, Judaism, Episcopalianism, and Native American traditions. A mutual friend described her as, quote, in a word, intrepid, unquote. And indeed, whether traveling in the mountains of Peru, to Jungian seminars in Ireland, or taking a road trip to Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, to the American Friends Service Committee's annual meetings. Phyllis is indeed a fearless adventurer, energetically immersing herself in the culture of each experience. Phyllis is also a loving, engaged, and patient listener, advocating for many, offering hospitality, and taking others into her home, often on short notice. Besides taking Osher lifelong learning or OLLI classes at Northwestern, and attending the yearly marathon 4-day, 10 to 12-hour medical conference, she appreciates art, theater, and concerts, often in the company of friends. In faithful service to our communities, Phyllis has eagerly participated in site preparation, organized a clerking workshop with Arthur Larrabee, most recently arranged a spiritual deepening program with Marcel Martin, as well as engaging in a variety of speakers to enrich the spiritual development of friends. Her sense of stewardship is manifested by her keen awareness that each of us shares the world with many peoples, mindful of other gifts of creation, like flora and living creatures, including the loving care of her rescue kitty, Tiger Lily. Phyllis will speak out of the silence. Friend Phyllis.
I want to use this opportunity to reflect on my spiritual journey and to express my gratitude for the growth and leadings I have received from this experience. I'm grateful for the support and insight from the Quaker community and for the invitation to give the Plummer Lecture. Thanksgiving morning, November 26, 2020, 9 months into the pandemic, I'm preparing to join a midweek Friends meeting. I share my reflections in this poem I wrote. Healing. What is the gift I want? To give or to receive? Healing is my immediate response from the Spirit. What does healing mean? Wholeness. What is my source of healing? From the sun, the sky, from the earth, from the Creator. Where do I find healing? In my breath, in my time in the natural world, in the seasons, in growth and release, in gratitude. As I reflect on this theme, two queries come to me. What stories do I want to tell, and what stories do I want to keep silent? Healing has many different meanings and roles in my life, starting with growing up and coming of age in a medical family. At that time, in the mid-20th century, the doctor was considered the authority on health, with all the first chosen and best answers. This was widely considered true in American culture, and especially in my family, where every challenging situation was considered from the medical perspective. Next was my leading to go into healthcare profession, becoming a nurse in 1976 and working as a visiting nurse in Chicago and the North Shore. Graduate school in nursing in 2004 led me to clinical experiences and also to write a thesis to explore illness and meaning. How do we understand and communicate what has happened to us in illness narratives? I had my own experience of serious illness following heart surgery in 2012. I continue to discover new meaning in my survival. My father attended medical school and did his residency in pediatrics in Washington University, St. Louis. My parents met and were married there. My father had a 6-month fellowship at the Princess Elizabeth of York Hospital in the East End of London, the location of the TV series Call the Midwife. He took his first job in Louisville, Kentucky. My mother, trained as a social worker, was director of the Red Cross in 1936, when a huge flood from the Ohio River overwhelmed Louisville. I never heard her say anything about this experience that I can remember. I wish I'd had the opportunity to talk to her. I was born September 20th, 1938 in Louisville. 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days after my birth, my identical twin brothers, Dick and David, were born. Their birth was a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. Soon America joined World War II, and my father enlisted as a flight surgeon and spent 9 months in Algeria. I don't have clear memories of my father's absence, but I do remember that I could tell my brothers apart and translate their language before our parents could. When my father returned from abroad, we moved to Fairlington, Virginia, a suburb built for military families near Washington, D.C. My father was working in the Pentagon. After the war, we moved to Springfield, Illinois. My grandparents, George and Margaret Mack, my father's parents, visited us every year on their way from Kentucky to their summer home in Wisconsin. I loved visiting them there for many years into my college years. Here's a poem I wrote about them. The only grandparents I knew. George Mack and Margaret Keller Mack were the parents of my father, John Keller Mack. George was a Presbyterian minister. Margaret's cousin was Helen Keller. They played together as children. Grandma and Grandpa lived in Bowling Green, Kentucky. They came to Springfield on the way to their cottage on Nestling Lake on the chain of lakes in Wapaka, Wisconsin. My brothers and I swam in the lake or paddled a small boat away from the dock. Sometimes we walked slowly into the water to the sudden drop-off. Tall, gangling plants swayed softly in the water before the lake became too deep to sustain them. Their cottage was very simple. The icebox was only that. A large block of ice kept the food cool and slowly melted before they got the next one. My family visited every summer for several weeks. I continued into the time I could drive independently. The last time I visited them there was 1963. I overheard a conversation between them through the simple walls of the cottage. I hope we can die together. His wish was not fulfilled. My mother's early years in Springfield created friendships that formed the basis of her social life. Newcomers Club welcomed new residents to Springfield. Women of that group and their children were part of my life through high school and beyond. I was able to transplant an unusual variety of violets from Ruth West Benjamin's yard to my own garden and enjoy them each spring. When a woman marries a man, that family becomes her family. This was the opinion I remember my father stating with his firm conviction and confidence. Why was there no room for both? Many of my mother's family lived in the southwestern Wisconsin, the Driftless area, where she had grown up in Montford. Once we went to see some of her family, and I remember how happy she was to see Aunt May and Aunt Grace. Both of her parents and her two older brothers had died before I was born. I climbed into the attic of the barn and ran around on the farm. I experienced a new level of happiness. Many years later, I visited Southwest Wisconsin and connected with members of the Dinsdale family. John Dinsdale, my mother's grandfather, had 12 children, 10 daughters and 2 sons. He had 2 wives. With his second wife, he had only 2 daughters. My mother was the only descendant. My earliest memory of a spiritual experience was while being at the foot of Cherry Road in Springfield, Illinois, where a small creek ran under the bridge. We had moved to this area on the west side of Springfield near Chatham Road in 1947. My father built a mail order house on land he purchased from the Bales farm. Our land was next door to the farmhouse. I had just read the Diary of Anne Frank and remembered being on the bridge on my way to school in 5th grade. I was moved by Anne's resilience in the face of adversity. Reading about her experience began my lifelong interest in Judaism and in the experiences of DPs, displaced persons who left Europe after World War II and came to America as children, some my own age. Several themes are woven together here. I felt an early and strong connection to the land. I spent much of the outside time in fields, forests, farmlands, and countryside on the edge of Springfield. I was often alone, but sometimes running around with other kids. I went to a nearby stable to take riding lessons. I patted horses across the road and in the lot next door. I read my favorite novel, Mrs. Mike, described as the heartwarming classic story of the Boston girl who married a rugged Canadian Mountie. I remember every night opening my bedroom window wide and letting in the winter air blow in. Perhaps I wanted to let Canada into my bedroom, or maybe this created my connection to the North Country. The only trip I made with my mother, Grace, was to New Orleans in my high school years. We traveled on the city of New Orleans and stayed in the French Quarter. I found a new kind of coffee I loved. I had just grown into the time of my life when I could drink coffee. We both enjoyed the experience very much. That trip began my lifelong interest in New Orleans, sustained by trips to visit my daughter Tammy and her family through the years. My pediatrician father, Keller Mack, was revered by his patients who were children my age and younger. Sometimes I made house calls with him. I remember collecting tiny tadpole eggs from the park with him. They hatched in the aquariums used to nurture fish for his office waiting room. Later, we returned to tadpoles to small ponds in the park before they grew. I was growing up on Cherry Road in the 1950s. Mary, a woman of color, came to work one day a week in our home. At that time in the 1950s, Domestic work was the only employment opportunity for many women of color. Springfield was segregated. White people lived on the west side, people of color on the east side. Mary taught me how to use the ironing machine in the basement, and I remember many experiences of pleasure with her. I followed her through her life long after she had moved on from working for us. She attended my father's funeral in 2002, and I was able to attend her funeral several years later. After I entered Springfield High School, I enjoyed my classes in Latin and English literature. Fast forward to 1956, I left for college. My freshman year was easy and simple. My sophomore year was problematic and I was not able to return. The next plan was for me to go to the University of Illinois. Academic problems recurred and the plan was made for me to go to St. Louis to see a psychiatrist. This person was recommended by one of my father's medical school classmates. 3 years of this talk therapy treatment from December 1960 to 63 did not correct my psyche or give me a sense of connection. I did find a roommate, a woman my own age, held on to my job at the hospital radiology department, and even went to parties with other people my age who were graduate students. Soon I realized I was pregnant. I did not want to share with the psychiatrist, fearing he would lead me to an abortion based on psychiatric diagnosis. I packed up and went home to Springfield. Choosing the psychiatric path was the only one to pursue. I thought this path was the most pain-free for my family, without the open discussion of complex and ambiguous feelings of distress. The plan was made. I would enter a psychiatric hospital near Milwaukee because the pregnancy was out of wedlock. Adoption was considered the best decision. I was admitted in February '64 to the Milwaukee Sanitarium, a hospital for persons with mental illness, established in 1884 on 36 hilly wooded acres in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. The history of the sanitarium quotes the founder, James McBride. Open air and open country is the best medicine for mental health. Cottages were built, each one housing a different group of patients: retired seniors, teenagers, women, longtime patients with a history of lobotomies, and a few others. Healing was hope, and hope were both results of my time at the SAN, but I did not receive them from the psychiatric staff. Other patients, mostly younger women, offered their own experiences to share, and I began to learn about how other people felt about their lives and how they spoke of them. One young man was admitted at the same time I was. Peter, not his real name, often played the Delta blues in his cottage room, on his guitar or from his record player. I heard this music as I walked around the campus in the months to come. How the blues saved my life was the theme of a story I wrote later. This experience made me aware of the resilience of the Black community. My father's the only one from my family who came to visit me after birth of my fraternal twins, a son and a daughter, born June 9th, 1964. When the twins were brought into my room, he burst into tears. I was surprised and silent. I did not know how to pursue the path for a deeper exploration of my feelings. Helping me become a single mother was not considered. The names I gave them were Philip and Elizabeth. Their adoptive family gave them different names. By the summer of 1965, a year after the twins were born, I was living in the adult cottage with Peter and Jack, not his real name. The three of us hung out on the stairs leading up to the second floor where other adults met. We participated in the sessions from this periphery. Jack was clear and direct in expressing his feelings and perspectives about his experience. As the summer ended, Jack was discharged. I realized I'd had enough. I left the SAN and shared an apartment with him for a while nearby Milwaukee. Then he left to go stay with a longtime friend in the East Village of New York. When I realized I had no life in this place, I left Milwaukee on the Greyhound bus. I went to Jack's address on the Lower East Side of New York. When I knocked on the door, he opened it. He looked surprised, but he welcomed me in. He was living with his longtime friend, Fran. He found another apartment in the same building and we moved in together. One time we were in Fran's apartment and a group of men arrived. The Velvet Underground was the name of the band. Later, I learned they were buying drugs. I was completely naive about this possibility. Drugs, marijuana, and LSD were an active part of the East Village in the 1960s, but never a significant part of my life. Jack and I slipped away from each other and he went to Mexico with Fran. The next chapter of my life began with the pregnancy and birth of my daughter, Tara, born in August of 1966. I had moved into my own New York apartment on 3rd Street between Avenue B and C. My space was a tenement on the 5th floor, a walk-up in the back of the building, 2 simple rooms. There was a small bedroom area with a large window connection to the other room, which contained the kitchen structures, the sink, the stove, and refrigerator. A large bathtub was covered with a wooden panel, providing space for food prep. This could be removed to bathe. A toilet was located in a tiny closet. 2 windows looked out to the rear of the building. The Lower East Side was the cherished destination of many European Jews who immigrated to America from 1870 to 1920. From women friends, I learned of the best hospital for delivery in New York. I met some other supportive people and worked as a nanny. I even met Dorothy Day, the leader of the Catholic worker movement. I was impressed by her personal welcome. Later, I learned she'd had 2 children without the support of a marriage. I wondered what my life might have been like if I'd followed her leading. Instead, I embraced a young Irish American man, and we were together for the next 6 years. We started our life together in rural New Jersey and experienced the birth of my second daughter, Dorothy, in April 1968. It was a tumultuous year, which included the death of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. We decided we needed a community. We moved to Champaign-Urbana. Now I found the welcoming experience of this meeting. Several older women were elders who nurtured me and my 2 young daughters. I began to attend Illinois yearly meeting. In the summer of 1969, I met more nurturing elders: Phyllis Berenson, Royal Buscombe, Nancy Breitsprecher. I immediately felt grounded in the landscape of McNabb with its deep Quaker roots. The year 1969 was marked by the death of my mother, Grace Melinda Smith Mack, after a long struggle with emphysema. She was only 61 years old, the same age as her mother, Ella Phyllis Dinsdale Smith, had died. I received an inheritance from my mother, enabled me to purchase a home in Urbana, and I planted my second white pine tree there. The first I planted in my Springfield home. Planting a white pine became my practice in each home I lived in. Fast forward 20 years to 1985. I'm living in Evanston, Illinois, where I moved after I married Wilford Reynolds in 1974. I've completed my nursing training at Ravenswood Hospital School of Nursing. I'm working as a visiting nurse through various neighborhoods in Chicago. My 2 daughters are progressing through schools. This time in America, adoption was no longer wrapped in the shame and secrecy that had cloaked it for many years. I found a group, Truth Seekers in Adoption, that met in Chicago monthly. The leader was Barbara Gagno, a birth mother. Each month we gathered and listened to many reunion stories from adoptive parents, birth mothers, and adoptees. One of the group's leaders suggested contact the adoption agency, but don't tell them you're searching. Send them your updated family medical information, your mother's death and father's prostate cancer, and ask about the life of the adopted twins. I had already found the updated birth records with their current names, Tammy and Tom. From the agency, I received a message. Thank you for your medical information. The daughter is interested in theater or the law, and the son is quite an athlete. After some reflection, I thought my daughter Tammy, growing up in the Midwest with an interest in theater, might be a student at Northwestern, which has a robust theater department. I called the student directory telephone line and asked for her phone number using her name. I was told she lived on Foster Avenue, just 2 blocks from my house on Orrington. Barbara helped me by making the first phone contact to explore whether Tammy was interested in meeting. And then we arranged a date in Tammy's apartment. I also informed the birth father that I had found the twins. Thus began the relationships, which continue today. My nursing career began with as a nursing assistant in a nursing home in Urbana-Champaign. A quotation by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said, who brought the hospice movement to America, "Those who spend time with people who are sick and dying can learn a lot about themselves." I knew I needed that. So I began nursing school at Ravenswood Hospital, and then began working in a surgical floor. Later became a visiting nurse, the Chicago Visiting Nurse Association. I made many visits to CHA housing, high rises, including Ida B. Wells, Stateway Gardens, and Robert Taylor homes, often to see newborn babies and young mothers, and sometimes adults with chronic problems like diabetes and long-term wounds. My nursing career continued north to Evanston and then further north to Highland Park. Here's a poem I wrote about the experiences as a visiting nurse. I've been in many different places in CHA housing, the high rises now demolished, in the homes of wealthy families on the lakefront, in the small apartment of a previously homeless woman. I have met and touched, bandaged and nurtured many different bodies, male and female, young and old, some beginning life, some moving into death. People I did not know before, some I would never see again, except for a few. Mary was my most memorable patient. She had a small Japanese home on a few acres. A tiny stream flowed through the land to a pond. I visited her for several years as she went through times in and then out of the hospital. Then we all realized recovery was not the next step of her path. I have 2,000 daffodils on that hill. It's not fair I have to leave them. Her anger was clear and outspoken. For several years, I had seen those spring blossoms and gone to her December birthday celebration. The next step was apparent. When the leaves fall, Mary is out of here. Oak leaves or maple leaves, Mary? We both knew some oak leaves do not fall until spring. Maple. She died November 14th. A memorial is held at her home in December. A friend and I look out the window. A coyote is running along the stream. He pauses, looking up to us. That's her, that's really her. Yes, yes, I know, you're right. I know it's her. The coyote runs on over the daffodil hill. In 1970, Wilford Reynolds, his son Hugh and nephew Hadley Reynolds purchased 40 acres of forest from 2 farmers, Orville and Yvette Martin, who owned land in the Garden Peninsula, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They decided they wanted to build their own cabin, and they met the Martins at a farm stand where Yvette was selling vegetables. They began the conversation about land purchase. We need to, and she was very delighted. We need to pay for our daughter's wedding. On that side of the road, there was no housing along the unsurfaced road, which continued several miles west to South River Bay on the edge of Lake Michigan. Now, many years later, 500 acres have been sold or donated to the Nature Conservancy. This is now known as the Haunted Forest. In 1970, the location for the cabin was chosen in an open meadow area of the woods. A large white river birch tree was anchor for the cabin. I think I'll read a poem that I wrote there when I was by myself. One animal among others. On my solo retreat in the North Woods, I am the only human I meet. A hummingbird, a raven, a crow, a tiny frog in the patch of green moss, a deer in the patch of green moss, a deer in the shadowy woods, a buck with antlers, a soft gait, fluffy blonde hair blowing in the wind. Because I sit quietly, they accept me. I do not seek another human companion. Because I am alone, I am not distracted or disturbed. I feel no puzzlement or panic. I observe the world I am part of. I make my food, wash my dishes. I sleep on my mattress on the floor. When rain comes, I observe the change in the light, the clouds, the leaves, the wind, and the sounds. My daughters and I and Wilfred visited the cabin every year, and we continued a close relationship with the Martins. My spiritual journey was mainly focused at Evanston Friends Meeting, but several other threads entered my experience. In the late 1980s, I began to work as a parish nurse at St. Paul's Lutheran Church and St. Mary's Catholic Church. The pastor and priest thought this would be a good ecumenical opportunity to foster interaction. I appreciated the opportunity to engage with both communities. And their common liturgical tradition led me to attend St. Luke's Episcopal Church. Another persistent practice mine had been Zen Buddhist meditation. I went to San Francisco Zen Center and visited my son Tom in California. And then I found Lakeside Buddhist Sangha in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. Judaism has spoken to me for many years. I took an introduction to Judaism in several Reform synagogues. I did not convert to Judaism. I do not have the Jewish tribal identity, which is inherited through ancestors and family. By Zoom, I've been able to attend Torah study with the Jewish congregation, Tzedek Chicago, whose Rabbi Brent Rosen is the former director of the American Friends Service Committee. In the past, in my Jungian studies, I found a comment by James Hillman, an analyst, comparing the traditions of Christianity and Judaism. The Christian scriptures focuses upward on spirit, vision, and healing. The Hebrew scripture focuses downward to soul, to depth, and to dreams. This comparison between the two traditions has been a memorable concept. Education has always been appealing to me. For several years in the 1980s, I took classes at the School of the Art Institute and even in performance art. When I walked into the special place, I knew immediately it was very special. When it was my turn to perform, I felt a strong sense of the spirit entering my body. This experience was similar but more intense and embodied than my experience of receiving the spirit during a Quaker meeting. Next, I took a bachelor's degree in nursing at North Park University. The next excursion was in 2002. I applied for a master's in nursing. I was forced to get a computer as education was changing. Research and writing required this new practice. Classes were held in the evenings and on weekends, and there were many nursing students, not only women, from different countries and backgrounds. Illness and Meaning was the title of the thesis when I graduated in 2004. Meaning begins to be important in the presence of death and the possibility of loss. Meaning resides in a deeper, more fundamental level that includes ambiguity, the presence of contradictory opposites, life and death. Much of our lives are lived on a more superficial level, where our goals, desires, and attachments are the primary concern. When these are jeopardized and relativized by more powerful experiences, such as life-threatening illness or overwhelming political realities, we are challenged to dig deeper in order to make sense of what has happened and to achieve what equanimity is possible. Other responses are common: denial, anger, projection, and a few. So we're seeking to understand not only why this happened, but what it will mean in our lives. Ultimately, we will try to discover a redemptive purpose or meaning in our suffering can be created. Meaning is constructed, discovered, and shared in the narratives we create to tell the stories of our lives. Stories have plot, drama, character, action, suspense, performances, silences, and subplots. And ultimately, meaning is revealed. Arthur Kleinman was a psychiatrist and medical anthropologist who explores the difference between the patient's experience of illness and the physician's biomedical concept of disease in his classic study, The Illness Narratives. Illness narratives share the personal experiences of those who've encountered illness. One of my favorites is Intoxicated by My Illness by Anatole Broyard. He was born in New Orleans in 1920. He had many Black ancestors, but he chose to pass as white and went to live in Greenwich Village in New York in 1946. This was a time of great creative energy in Greenwich Village. For many years, he reviewed books for the New York Times. I found the story of his life in Life Stories profiles from The New Yorker. Henry Louis Gates wrote White Like Me, a profile of Broyard. In 1989, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Broyard writes his desire to be seen by his physician, to be enjoyed by him. I want to be a good story for him, to give him some of my art in exchange for his, just as he orders blood tests and scans of my body. I'd like my daughter to scan me to grow my spirit as well as my prostate. Broyard is aware of the power inequity between the doctor and the patient. I'd like him to know that I feel superior to him too, that he is my patient too, and I have a diagnosis for him. There should be a place where our respective superiority could meet. In an epilogue written after his death, his widow, Alexandra, said he asked if he was found the doctor he was looking for. His typical style and humor, he said, "My urologist is a very handsome man. He's slender and a fabled tennis player. He wears very expensive loafers and has a $60 haircut. He comes into the room like a matador. He has style, he has magic, and he's extremely competent. He doesn't talk. He's too much of a star, but he has an oncologist who talks for him." Another writer I found to be especially meaningful was Arthur W. Frank, a medical sociologist at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. He wrote The Will of the Body. My own illness narrative began in July 2020 when I received an email from my cardiologist. He would not renew my cholesterol medicine unless I came to see him in his office. "So how's everything going?" "Oh, I'm okay. Maybe I'm a little more short of breath, but isn't anyone climbing up 2 flights of stairs to the L, huh? Let's do a stress test." That same day I do a stress test and flunk it. I keep going, keep going, keep going. The technician urges me to push on. That's it, I can't go any further. "You need an angiogram. That might need some stents if we find some blockages in your arteries. The stents could be placed and you could go home the next day." That doesn't sound like a big deal. I would miss a day of work. The angiogram is not difficult. I'm an alert, observant participant without much memorable discomfort. "Stents won't work. Your particular blockages can only be repaired by cardiac surgery." I am stunned. A cardiac surgeon is upstairs and comes down to talk to me. "I could do the surgery on Thursday." He's a tall young man with a handsome suit. He gives me his card. I sign up immediately, and obediently 2 of my daughters, who are physicians, Tara and Tammy, they're both able to come on short notice and are there when I go into the operating room. After surgery, the next step is the rehabilitation facility. As my recovery progresses, I notice I'm having more trouble with my breathing. But the nurse goes home before she comes to me. I talk to Tara on the phone. Have them call an ambulance. Be sure they take you to Evanston Hospital, not Death Valley Hospital. Tara had grown up in Evanston, and that was the nickname of the hospital in Skokie. That step was accomplished. I have few memories of my experience. I was on life support for 3 weeks in intensive care. The next step was rehab at the Presbyterian home. After leaving that facility in November 2012, I went home. I was grateful in my own home again with my cats, Mackie and Sushi. Elizabeth Murdick had cared for them both while I was sick. The next step was cardiac rehab, 3 times a week for an hour and a half, and then pulmonary rehab, same place, same schedule, different day. The staff was warm and friendly, but there was little interaction with other attendees. Later, I returned and said, what about more psychosocial interaction? What brought you there? What happened? How do you feel about this? Oh, people don't want to talk about that. They want to protect their privacy. When they graduate their last session, before discharge, they can share their feelings. Sometimes I feel odd in the eyes of friends who are healthcare providers when I tell them I was in ICU. Later, I shared this with Virginia. Oh, that's déformation professionnelle, a French phrase meaning a tendency to look at things from the point of view of one's own profession, rather than from a broader perspective. How do people who have worked closely in intensive care hospital situations, view the patients who survive that experience? How do they imagine them to be now? How do I step outside the identity I imagine other authoritative, confident medical people have of me? I have several memories of encounters with healthcare professionals after my illness. When I was about to be discharged after my ICU experience, I met with a cardiac surgeon in his small office. He seemed awkward and uncomfortable with me. What if he had been able to say to me, I'm really sorry you had these complications after your heart surgery? Would that mean I might put him in a position of liability to be sued for a medical mistake? Once after my discharge, I went to the ICU unit. One of the nursing students I'd worked with at the master's program came to the entry. He looked stunned, puzzled, uncomfortable to see me. What were his impressions and questions? 2 years after my illness, I felt I'd recovered. I decided I wanted to travel and chose to go to Ireland to a program organized by Jung on the Hudson. After many years of contact with Carl Jung's thoughts and workshops. A women's retreat in 2014 in County Donegal, near Northern Ireland, was my first experience. During breaks, I walked along the ocean and was often joined by Irish racehorses, trained and practicing running in the shallow water by the edge. Here's a poem I wrote about that experience. This is in the tradition of Amerigen from Anam Cara, a book of Celtic wisdom by Father John O'Donoghue, an Irish priest and a writer. When spring comes to Ireland, County Donegal, I am the raucous rooks circling their tall colonial nest. I am Eros, residing at the hospital, awaiting a call to healing. Thanatos is not the only god who lives here. I am the ancient tree on the road, older than any human person who passes. My roots are deep, my branches are tall, my leaves are emerging again. I have one of 28 women together by the ocean. Susie, Suzanne, Susanna, Susie, Sue, Sally, and 22 others. Some of us are teachers, some students. Some are therapists, some receive therapy. Some are therapists, some are writers, some artists. All seek the path we need and long for. We're all daughters, some are grandmothers. Many are mothers of children, grown, growing, some lost. I am dew on the grass, graced by a rainbow. I am new buds emerging. I am sun, wind, and clouds, rain and ocean, green grass at my feet. I am in my place in the wild world. When I reflect on what drew me to Ireland, part of it was a family history of John Mack. He was part of the MacGregor clan in Scotland. At a time of serious conflict among different clans, keeping his name MacGregor was considered a death sentence. So he changed his name to Mack and went to Londonderry and eloped with the Earl of Londonderry's daughter, and they founded Derry, New Hampshire. I attended 2 more Jungian workshops in Ireland. They were both with the Benedictine monks of Glenstal Abbey. The monks had also managed a boarding school, and we occasionally ate lunch with the restless teenage boys. Forgiveness was the theme of one retreat I attended. One attender at the last day of the session, when we were there for questions, said, this was an interesting presentation on forgiveness, but what about self-forgiveness? This was a gap of long silence. Even a gasp of startled breath followed the question. That's a good question. Clearly, this was not a perspective the presenters had considered. I don't recall what was said, but some response was delivered. Another workshop I attended was led by R.E.I. Meidenbaum, the co-director of Jung on the Hudson. The workshop topic was the archetypes of resilience, the Jewish experience. My life in art. Visual art has been an important influence in my life. For many years, my first experience was in grade school. Miss Roper was our art teacher. Fran, a good friend of mine, had wonderful drawing skills that I could never match. My next experience was many years later, after I became a nurse and began working in Chicago. I have taken classes at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, drawing and painting at the Evanston Art Center, and botanic illustration at the Chicago Botanic Garden. I remember a class in Evanston with Frank Piatek, who graduated and taught at SAIC. Wikipedia describes Frank Piatek as an American artist known for abstract, illusionistic paintings of tubular forms and 3-dimensional works exploring spirituality, cultural memory, and the creative process. One day in winter, there was a severe blizzard. I was the only one beside Frank who made the trip to in the dangerous weather. Frank said, in making art, following your personal leading is the most important practice you can create. This statement deeply resonated with my Quaker experience. On my way north to the northern Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I usually stopped in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and visited the James Michael Kohler Museum. There I became engaged with outsider art. These are often self-taught artists, and their creations were more compelling to me than the work of classical European artists. The primary change in my perspective, excuse me, since my illness in 2012 has been my leading to describe and express my experiences in poetry. Perhaps there was something about my illness experience that freed my right brain. As I near the end of this Plummer lecture, I want to conclude by sharing another poem from this year of the pandemic. A Woman in the World, March 12th, 2021. The first deep snowfall of this winter season calls me out as evening comes. The snow is still, clear, and softly curved across the lawns and bushes, like soft white pillows. A tall tree beside the sidewalk is like a woman with her roots reaching deeply into the earth. Beneath the snow, she raises her arms in praise. Snow gently fills the nooks and crannies of her body with delicate softness and detail in her throat, her shoulders, her wrists, her hips and legs. I want to touch the carefully landed snowflakes. She reaches into the sky to embrace the spirits that nourish her. Many days later, more snow has fallen. As time passes, the temperature is warming. Beside each trunk, a circle of open space emerges as the snow melts. Her body releases her warmth into the world around her. When all the snow has sunk into the earth, her roots are revealed. Some twist and turn, some lift the sidewalk at its edge, not nearly as assertive as the live oaks of New Orleans. Each one has a trunk whose skin is different in texture, color, and structure. Some are related to others, some are unique. Each has her own tribal identity. After St. Patrick's Day, a celebration of the Emerald Isle, tiny small grass lifts from the ground. Green begins to enter the landscape. Soon all their leaves will flutter in the wind, in the rain, in sun, and in shade. Our world will soon become full of chlorophyll, the roots of my name, Phyllis, lover of plants.